Hello, good evening and welcome to the History of Gardens and Designed Landscapes seminar and to the start of a new two-term programme of presentations looking at gardens in literature and letters. Launching the programme, we're privileged to welcome Dr. Brent Elliott. As many of you will know, Dr. Elliott was formerly the librarian and then the historian of the Royal Horticultural Society. He's the author of several books, including Victorian Gardens, and he's recently co-edited with Sarah Dewis an anthology of 19th century garden writing. As well as having been a member of English Heritage Historic Parks and Gardens Committee, Dr. Elliott has served on the Victorian Society's Building Committee for 45 years. This evening, Dr. Elliott's focus is less on the Victorian gardens and plants with which many will associate him, but more on their presence in historical novels of the 19th century. As he says in his synopsis, he will be addressing the sources of the various authors' garden descriptions and asking how far these descriptions reflected contemporary styles, and indeed whether they in turn influenced those styles. So it's with anticipation and great pleasure that I hand over to Dr. Elliott to give us the benefit of his always fresh and illuminating scholarship. Thank you, Dr. Elliott.
Thank you, Pippa. My subject tonight is the gardens in 19th century historical novels. And the first question we must ask is, what is an historical novel? Various definitions have been offered. A novel set at least 50 years before its writing, a novel set before the birth of the novelist, other definitions based on ideological requirements. So it's only fair that I reveal my own notion. An historical novel is not just a work of fiction set in the past. Such things have been written since ancient times. The Icelandic sagas of the 14th century were tales of the ancestors generally set about 3 centuries earlier. The most famous French novel of the 17th century is La Princesse de Clèves, set roughly a century earlier. But in none of these is there any sense that people described in the stories are in any way significantly different from the novel's readers. Human nature, these writers assumed, was unchanging, always the same. But in the 20th century, it was easy to find people declaring that human nature does change, and that we cannot assume that people in the past had the same ideas, feelings, or thoughts as ourselves. A few examples. L.P. Hartley in The Go-Between, 1953. The past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. Louis MacNeice in Autumn Journal, 1938, evaluating the relevance of an education based on the ancient Greeks and Romans. And how one can imagine oneself among them, I do not know. It was all so unimaginably different and all so long ago. John Gloag in Design in Modern Life, 1934, complaining about the fashion for neo-Tudor houses. It's been built in quite a different way from a real Tudor house, and it's been built by people totally different from the people who lived in the 16th century. So you get the idea. Whether you agree with it or not, it has been a prevalent opinion in the last century or so that human nature is not permanent and unchanging, and that people in the past cannot be assumed to share the mental world of the present. When did this attitude arise? I would say in the generation following the end of the Napoleonic Wars. I'll make my point by comparing a passage from Sir Walter Scott, whom I regard as the father of the historical novel, and an eminent predecessor from the previous generation. That work is The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe, published in 1795. The book that the Gothic novel, a major genre in European literature, though from our point of view, we can discard the Gothic and consider it as the great novel of the picturesque. Had there ever previously been a novel so copiously filled with descriptions of landscape? What is more, the heroine, Emily, is very sensitive to the impressions of landscape and devotes herself to them. She rambles among scenes both picturesque and sublime and is prompted to pious thoughts. One representative extract. Before them extended the valley they had quitted. Its rocks and woods to the left, just silvered by the rays, formed a contrast to the deep shadow that involved the opposite cliffs, whose fringed summits only were tipped with light, while the distant perspective of the valley was lost in the yellow mist of moonlight. The travellers sat for some time wrapped in the complacency which such scenes inspire. These scenes, said Valancourt at length, soften the heart like the notes of sweet music, and inspire that delicious melancholy which no person who had felt it once would resign for the gayest pleasures. They waken our best and purest feelings, disposing us to benevolence, pity, and friendship. The scene of Udolpho was set in 1584. Is this really how people behaved then? Take Emily's delight in the picturesque and sublime, her writing of poetry showing the influence of James Thomson and William Cowper, not to mention her habit of fainting whenever her pulse rate exceeds 80 beats a minute. And I would say that Emily is a well-brought-up young lady of the 1790s who has somehow wandered into a narrative set 2 centuries earlier. Now, jump ahead a quarter of a century and compare this with the following passage from Scott's 1820 novel, The Monastery. Yet, though thus embellished, the scene could neither be strictly termed sublime or beautiful, and scarcely even picturesque or striking. These are ideas, however, of a far later age. For at the time we treat of, the picturesque, the beautiful, the sublime, and all their intermediate shades were ideas absolutely unknown to the inhabitants and occasional visitors of Glendarg. Scott has thrown down the gauntlet to Radcliffe and her entourage. The emotions she confidently assumed were inherent in humanity are historically contingent. Multiply this tenfold with our other aspects of life, and you'll get the effect that Scott had on his readers. Some people embraced this early form of historical relativism with enthusiasm. Ludwig Tieck, in the preface to his novel Victoria a Corombona, 1840, set in the 16th century, announced one of the aims of his novel. A picture of the times seemed to call for a sketch of the human mind as it existed at that period. And in 1829, in the preface to his novel A Chronicle of the Reign of Charles IX, Prosper Mérimée had become the first novelist I have found to state that we should not judge the people of the past by the standards of today. For other people, the idea of historical relativism was unsettling, a difficult problem to cope with. James Anthony Froude, in his History of England from the fall of Wolsey to the Spanish Armada, said, "And now it is all gone, like an unsubstantial pageant faded. And between us and the Old English, there lies a gulf of mystery, which the prose of the historian will never adequately bridge. They cannot come to us, and our imagination can but feebly penetrate to them." That gulf was the special province of the historical novel, and it was the historical novel that first spread these ideas to the public. How? By research. The works I'll be discussing tend to be novels with footnotes, with appendices, with interpolated essays, sometimes with quotations from historical documents quoted in the text. It became one of the criteria by which historical novels were judged, how much new and startling information about the past the novelist could provide. The expectation that the historical novel would be informed by scholarship had become so standard by mid-century that R.D. Blackmore, introducing his novel Lorna Doone in 1869, specifically described it as an historical romance, so that readers would not expect the scholarly detail they would find in an historical novel. And sometimes this research extended into the garden. Now, not all historical novels describe gardens. Even novels that mention gardens often mention them only in passing. You can learn from them that some people have gardens, that these gardens are entered through gates, that they sometimes have trees in them, that people go for walks in them, and sometimes sit down and have conversations in them. Not enough to qualify as a treatment of gardens for my purposes. One of the greatest historical novels, Manzoni's Betrothed, 1827, a work written on a level of scholarship that Scott never achieved, is set in the early 17th century and wanders all over the territory between Milan and Lake Como without ever trespassing into a garden. It does, to be true, have a good description of harvesting walnuts, and a splendid passage describing the weeds that have grown up in Renzo's vineyard during his 2 years of enforced absence. There are no gardens in The Three Musketeers or in 20 Years After, although in the latter work Athos does at one point complain that somebody's been trampling his irises. There are no gardens in Ivanhoe, Alfred de Vigny's Saint-Mars, or Charles de Coste's Till Eulenspiegel. There are no gardens in The Cloister and the Hearth, Adalbert Stifter's Witiko, or in Henryk Sienkiewicz's great trilogy about the Polish Wars of the 17th century. Though when Jan Skrzytuski returns home to find his estate burned by the Cossacks, one of the things that has been destroyed is his cherry orchard, never otherwise mentioned. So it's a limited sample of the genre that I shall be dealing with in this paper. And I'm not going to spend any time, except incidentally, discussing novelists' errors in the history of garden plants. The field is too large. Alphonse Karr, in his 1861 book Les Fleurs, lists some of the bungles about plants that could be discovered in French novels, not just historical ones. Madame Sand spoke of blue chrysanthemums. Monsieur de Balzac described an azalea climbing up a house. Monsieur Janin thought he saw blue carnations, and Monsieur Rolle celebrated the intoxicating fragrance of camellias. I know of only one novelist who corrected errors about plants in his writing, and that was Georg Ebers, the Egyptologist, who in the preface to the 5th edition of his novel An Egyptian Princess, 1877, said that he had listed mimosas among the plants growing in ancient Egypt, but had now learned that they were an introduction from America, and that bananas had been introduced into the Nile Valley by the Arabs. These and other errors he set out to correct. I cannot, however, leave this subject without commenting on An Olympic Standard bungle by George Moore in his novel The Brook Kerith, 1916, a novel which became notorious for its plotline, that Christ did not die on the cross, but survived, recovered, got a good job as a gardener, then as a shepherd, and lived completely oblivious to the religion that was growing up about him. In 2 different chapters, Moore refers to cactus hedges. He had seen these in Jerusalem, but had failed to inquire into their antiquity. The French had begun using prickly pear as a hedging plant in their new colony of Algeria in the mid-19th century, and the custom had spread. To be fair, Maurice Hewlett had also mentioned a cactus hedge, although less prominently, in his 1900 novel Richard Yea and Nay, but so perhaps Moore got the idea from him. Now, in examining 19th century novels for their treatment of gardens, it'll be understood that we're mainly considering them as reflections of 19th century attitudes, as reactions to changes in taste rather than as influences upon it. But there is a great exception at the very beginning of the historical novel with Walter Scott's first novel, Waverley, in 1814. Waverley is set in the 1740s at the time of Bonnie Prince Charlie's attempted invasion of England. One of the major characters is the Highland laird, Baron Bradwardine, proprietor of an estate called Tully Veolan. We are presented with a garden which seemed to be kept with great accuracy, abounded in fruit trees, and exhibited a profusion of flowers and evergreens cut into grotesque forms. It was laid out in terraces, which descended rank by rank from the western wall to a large brook, where it served as a boundary to the garden. Bradwardine is imprisoned for his role in the Jacobite rebellion, but is granted a pardon and finds on his return home that his house and garden have had a makeover. There's a new greenhouse. Alas, Scott tells us nothing about what was planted in it. And the house itself has been thoroughly repaired, as well as the gardens, with the strictest attention to maintain the original character of both, and to remove as far as possible all appearance of the ravage they had sustained. So the grotesque forms of the topiary are retained. Scott acknowledged in a note that he had based the garden at Tully Veolan on the garden at Ravelston, which the taste of the proprietor, the author's friend and kinsman, Sir Alexander Keith, Knight Mareschal, has judiciously preserved. I have not discovered any illustrations of the topiary at Ravelston. The house burned down in 1913, and there was no attempt at restoration. The Gardener's Chronicle described the garden in 1890 as a well-preserved example of the old Dutch style of garden, i.e. topiary, with the least touch here and there of modern taste. Now, Scott was no great lover of topiary. He wrote 2 articles on landscape gardening for the Quarterly Review, and makes it clear that his tastes were pretty much those of Usedale Price. The picturesque garden providing an architectural setting around the house, but no such artificiality as topiary, which Scott scathingly dismissed as monstrosities and defacements. But even there, Scott was able to suggest that their rarity now entitles them to some care as a species of antiques. Scott's great project was peacemaking between the disparate parts of the United Kingdom, between the Scots and the English, and between the Highland and Lowland Scots. Hence his masterminding of the royal visit of George IV to Scotland, the revival of the kilt, etc. In Waverley, the restoration of the rebel lord's garden becomes a moral signpost. We can all get along peaceably if we learn to respect and even appreciate the peculiarities of our neighbours. Waverley furnishes the 19th century's first nod of approval for topiary. Its novelty is perhaps indicated by the fact that most illustrated editions of the novel show the house, but not the garden. But it wasn't absolutely the beginning of the topiary revival, for Humphrey Repton had included, in the gatehouse garden he created for Woburn Abbey in 1804, a tree whose lower portion was carved into topiary leaving the upper reaches to bush out naturally. But did Scott know about this? The work may have been carried out in 1804, but the plate and text describing it were not published until 1816, 2 years after Waverley. Did the apparent approval of topiary in Waverley influence Burton in making it known? And 8 years after Waverley, Loudon, in the first edition of his influential Encyclopedia of Gardening, said, "Since the introduction of the modern or natural style of gardening into Britain, it has been a common practice to condemn indiscriminately every other taste as unnatural and absurd. If by unnatural an allusion is made to the verdant scenery of uncultivated nature, we allow that this is the case. But we would ask if for that reason it follows that, though now absurd, ancient gardens were not as natural and reasonable in their day as any of the manners and customs of these times." Would he have reached that conclusion without the aid of Scott? Scott definitely became more tolerant of topiary as his career advanced. There is topiary at the Scott's estate at Abbotsford, but it was only added by his successors, the Hope Scott family. In his third novel, The Antiquary, 1816, Scott described the garden of an estate called Monkbarns. It was surrounded by tall, clipped hedges of yew and holly, some of which still exhibited the skill of the topiarian artist, and presented curious armchairs, towers, and the figures of St. George and the dragon. The taste of Mr. Oldbuck did not disturb these monuments of an art now unknown, and he was the less tempted to do so, as it must necessarily have broken the heart of the old gardener. And Scott added a footnote to explain the meaning of topiary to his readers on the assumption that they wouldn't be familiar with the word. By the time of Woodstock in 1826, he was so laid back about it that he could describe a garden which, in all the pride of the topiary art, it presented a succession of yew trees cut into fantastic forms, of close alleys and of open walks. Now, here is the only illustration I've been able to find of topiary at Tully Veolan, dating from the 1890s, and the shapes of the trees have a suspicious resemblance to those at Leven's Hall, which is illustrated by Joseph Nash in the 1840s. Whether as an accurate description of the garden as it was then, or as a fantasy sketch that was later followed at Leven's itself. Enthusiasm for topiary, at first primarily for architectural topiary, hedges taking the place of walls, columns, and doorways, erupted in the 1850s after the opening to the public of Elveston Castle. But the old contempt still lingered in many quarters, as seen in Charles Kingsley's novel Westward Ho, published in 1855, set in the second half of the 16th century, running up to the time of the Armada. The southern court had become a flower garden, with quaint terraces, statues, knots of flowers, clipped yews and hollies, and all the pedantries of the topiarian art. Altogether, the house, like the time, was in a transitionary state, and represented faithfully enough the passage of the old Middle Age into the new life which had just burst into blossom throughout Europe, never, let us pray, to see its autumn or its winter. So, one historical novelist at least had a significant influence on one aspect of gardening. In what follows, instead of treating the historical novel in its chronological developments as literary genre, I'm going to group the novels according to the periods of garden history that they dealt with: classical times, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance and Baroque period, and lastly, the later 18th century and the rise of the landscape garden. So, seatbelts fastened? We start with classical times. The vast majority of novels about classical times are set in the first 3 centuries AD and concentrate on the rise of Christianity. The pioneering example of these novels was The Epicurean, published in 1827 by Thomas Moore. Moore is best known as a poet and songwriter, and indeed, The Epicurean started life as a poem entitled Alciphron, but after writing a portion of it, he decided to switch to prose. It is narrated by the head of the school of Epicurus, and describes his obsession with and eventual conversion by a female Christian. There is plenty about gardens here, but no attempt at historical realism. Some of the gardens are underground, and they generally owe more to the Arabian Nights than to any description of actual gardens. But the book was translated into French, Italian, Dutch, and German at least, so its influence cannot be discounted. In 1839, an edition containing both the novel and the stump of the original poem was published, with illustrations by Turner. The plate depicting the Garden of Epicurus is obviously set in Athens, because the Parthenon and the Erechtheium can be seen, but the classical funfair below them could not have been fitted into the streetscape of Athens. There are differences of opinion about whether the Epicurus's garden was inside or outside the gates of Athens, but all the ancient sources agree it was a small garden. So the work that really set the standard for novels about the early Christian years was The Last Days of Pompeii, written by Edward Bulwer-Lytton, published in 1834. This novel had a phenomenal success and has continued to influence our understanding of the buried city ever since. The main contemporary account of the eruption was the letters of the younger Pliny, but more than literary sources was available for Bulwer-Lytton: archaeology. The excavation of the site had begun in the mid-18th century, and since the 1810s had been stepped up under the influence of Sir William Gell of the Society of Dilettanti, who published 3 volumes of descriptions and illustrations of the sites that were being uncovered. Bulwer-Lytton acknowledged Gell's work in the text of his novel. One of the sites that Gell had dealt with most extensively was a house unearthed in 1824 that he named the House of the Tragic Poet because of the wall decorations. Bulwer-Lytton made this the house of his chief character, Glaucus. The year after the novel was published, Gell wrote to the Dilettanti that it had peopled the ruins with his characters, and the House of the Tragic Poet was now fixed in his mind as Glaucus's house. The theme of Christianity appears midway through the book and gradually grows in importance as rumors of a new cult begin to be heard, and then a Christian character appears, and finally the principal character is converted. In his 3rd chapter, Bulwer-Lytton described the general layout of Pompeian houses and their gardens, emphasizing that the garden was an interior courtyard in the house rather than something outside it. If the house was small, its boundaries ceased with this colonnade, and in that case its center, however diminutive, was ordinarily appropriated to the purpose of a garden and adorned with vases of flowers placed upon pedestals. Supposing the house was large, it did not end with a peristyle, and the center thereof was not in that case a garden, but might be perhaps adorned with a fountain or a basin for fish. These apartments communicated again with a square or oblong space, usually adorned on 3 sides with a colonnade like the peristyle. This was the proper viridarium or garden, being commonly adorned with a fountain or statues or a profusion of gay flowers. At its extreme end was the gardener's house. On either side beneath the colonnade were sometimes, if the size of the family required it, additional rooms. And in the 5th chapter, he made the observation that the garden answered to the inhabitants of the southern cities the same purpose that a greenhouse or conservatory does to us. The size of the garden did not adapt it for exercise, but the various and fragrant plants with which it was filled gave a luxury to that indolence so dear to dwellers in a sunny clime. There are other shorter pieces of garden description, but the climax for the reader comes at the end when, in a turn that had no precedent in previous fiction, Bulwer-Lytton suddenly brings us to the remains of Pompeii at the present day and identifies some of the skeletons visible in various places with characters in his book. 2 decades after Bulwer-Lytton, the debates about the early centuries of Christianity resulted in a group of novels. In 1853, Charles Kingsley published Hypatia, or New Foes with an Old Face. The new foes being the Roman Catholics, whose influence Kingsley saw as increasing. After all, only 3 years earlier, a Roman Catholic cardinal had been appointed to England for the first time in 300 years. The old face was Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria, and the monks under his direction, who murdered the Alexandrian philosopher Hypatia in AD 415, showing that Christianity was already leaving the true path and proceeding into darkness. Kingsley's main sources were the 47th chapter of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the ecclesiastical history of Socrates Scholasticus, and the letters of Synesius. Hypatia had been a Neoplatonist philosopher and mathematician, author of commentaries on Euclid and Diophantus. But Kingsley suggests she might have become a Christian if she hadn't been murdered, and the Christianity that she discusses in the book is generally compatible with Protestantism. The opening chapters of the novel establish a contrast between 2 gardens: the community garden of a colony of monks, where a novice monk is banned from going beyond the garden wall because he has seen that there are women outside, and the garden of the Alexandrian Museum, featured on the front cover of this German edition. whose flower beds, shrubberies, fountains, statues, walks, and alcoves had echoed for nearly 700 years to the wisdom of the Alexandrian sages and poets. Kingsley's novel was seen by Catholics as a challenge, and it prompted a pair of novels in reply. The first, published the following year, was Fabiola, or The Church of the Catacombs, by England's new Cardinal Nicholas Wiseman. There are scattered references to gardens, but the most significant statement for us is a reflection in Wiseman's habitual series of terms on the moral character of gardens. The dusty garden and the artificial fountain, the marble bath and the painted vault, were more beautiful in his eyes than fresh autumn vineyards, pure streams, purple ocean, and azure sky. He forgot that all these were but the accessories to a living and panting mass of human beings, whose passions they enkindled, whose evil desires they inflamed, whose ambition they fanned, whose resolutions they melted, and whose minds they enervated. Poor youth, he thought he could walk through that fire and not be scorched. Poor moth, he imagined he could fly through that flame and have his wings unscathed. Well, that puts gardens in their place, doesn't it? Toward the end of the 19th century, a big illustrated edition was published in both English and German, which reproduced, as shown on this slide, some illustrations of Roman gardens, but there is little text to accompany them. Another year later, John Henry Newman, a controversial convert to Catholicism but not yet a cardinal, published a novel entitled Callista, A Tale of the 3rd Century. More venturesome than Wiseman, Newman described a small private garden containing a palm and orange trees, and even listed the plants used in the flower beds. The borders and beds were gay with the lily, the bacchar, the garden abratomus, the red chelidonium, and the variegated iris. Against the wall of the house were trained pomegranates with their crimson blossoms, the star-like pothos or jessamine, and the symbolical passion flower which well became a Christian dwelling. You see that list of plants becoming steadily more improbable as it reaches the end. I'm sure I can't visualize a plant that could have been called both pothos and jessamine. And as far as passion flowers, they were introduced from the Americas in the 1610s. In the same year that Callista was published, the Cottage Gardener magazine made fun of Daniel Maclise for including a passion flower in his painting of a scene from As You Like It. But the symbolical passion flower had been revived as a subject of antiquarian interest by George Hone in his Everyday Book, 1826, and it looks as though the credulous Newman had fallen for it. The high point of Callista is a wonderful description of a plague of locusts, and the tail end of this brings to attention a facet of gardening that Newman's predecessors had rather ignored. The slaves of the farm of Varius were sorrowfully turning to a new employment, that of clearing away the wreck and disappointment of the bright spring from flower bed, vineyard, and field. Newman's work, while it was translated, had nothing of the esteem in the 19th century that Wiseman's novel did, though in the 20th century their degree of popularity seems to have been reversed. So Newman's acknowledgement of the role of slaves in classical gardens did not have the impact on subsequent writers that it should have. It remained for Henryk Sienkiewicz to bring the matter more fully into consciousness in his 1895 novel Quo Vadis, whose impact was enormous and sustained through the 20th century by films. If you know of Quo Vadis only from film versions, dismiss them from your mind. It's a philosophical novel and debates between different schools of philosophy, including on the merits of this new cult of Christianity, featured far more than anything a movie producer would regard as action. There's a sequence in which Ligeia, covertly a Christian, is taken to the imperial gardens. For the first time in her life, Ligeia saw those magnificent gardens, full of pines, cypresses, oaks, olives, and myrtles, among which appeared, white here and there, a whole population of statues. The mirror of ponds gleamed quietly. Groves of roses were blooming, watered with the spray of fountains. Entrances to charming grottos were encircled with the growth of ivy or woodbine. Silver-colored swans were sailing on the water. Amid statues and trees wandered tame gazelles from the deserts of Africa and rich-colored birds from all known countries on earth. The gardens were empty, but here and there slaves were working, spade in hand, singing in an undertone. Others, to whom was granted a moment of rest, were sitting by ponds or in the shades of groves, in trembling light produced by sun rays breaking in between leaves. Others were watering roses, or the pale lily-covered blossoms of the saffron. Actaeon and Ligeia walked rather long, looking at all the wonders of the gardens. And though Ligeia's mind was not at rest, she was too much a child yet to resist pleasure, curiosity, and wonder. It occurred to her even that if Caesar were good, he might be very happy in such a palace, in such gardens. There is one of those moments of moral about-turn that Zienkiewicz delighted in, when you suddenly see things from the other side. He makes the point that Christianity emerged in a society in which slavery was a norm and did not question that norm. The behavior of the slaves, by the way, was modeled on that of former slaves on plantations in America, as seen by Zienkiewicz when he traveled there in the 1870s. It adds to the irony that the next time we see her showing the imperial gardens, all the roads and paths are lined with crosses to which Christians are nailed and set on fire to illuminate the garden. Other novelists in the latter part of the 19th century added details. Walter Pater, in Marius the Epicurean, on the use of gardens as family cemeteries. Anatole France, in Thais, on the use of erotic statuary. But the early Christianity novel culminated in 1880 with Lew Wallace's Ben-Hur, which for a while was the bestseller of bestsellers, and through its subsequent progeny of stage plays and movies has left its trail to the 20th century. At the time Wallace wrote Ben-Hur, he had never been to Palestine, though the year after its publication, he was appointed American consul to the Ottoman Empire, possibly as a result of the prestige of his novel, which, if true, shows that the American tradition of appointing weirdly unqualified people to diplomatic posts goes back a long way. His main literary sources were Plutarch and Josephus, and William Hepworth Dixon's 1865 travelogue, The Holy Land. But there were further sources of information available by the 1870s for him to use. The painting of Palestinian scenes had been pioneered by David Roberts in the 1840s and continued at a steady pace. When Frederick Edwin Church exhibited his great painting, Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, in 1870, he accompanied it with a brochure itemizing the sites that could be distinguished. And from the 1850s, there was a steady flow of photographs of the Holy Land, frequently in stereoscope form. It was possible to get a very good visual impression of the scenes of the Bible from readily available sources. Wallace put these to good use in conjuring up an image of the rooftop gardens of Jerusalem. The motive that prompts the decoration at whatever cost of interiors in colder climes suggested to the Oriental the embellishment of his housetop. The parapet ordered by Moses became a potter's triumph. Above that later arose towers, plain and fantastic. Still later, kings and princes crowned their roofs with summer houses of marble and gold. When the Babylonian hung gardens in the air, extravagance could push the idea no further. Wallace did not provide much detail on the page about the roof gardens of Jewish houses, but possibly as a result of his travels while consul to the Ottoman Empire, he got more information. Ben-Hur was made into a stage play under Wallace's direction, and in 1901 a special edition of the novel was published, illustrated with still photographs from the stage play. This is the earliest such illustrated novel that I've come across so far, not that I've looked with any determination. The photographs show the arrangement of trellis work on a roof garden. The original readers of Ben-Hur might not have gathered this impression from it, but later readers had augmented sources of information from Wallace on this subject through the stage and later films. But the most striking scene in the novel from the gardening point of view is the treatment of the sacred grove of Daphne in Antioch. You will all be familiar with the story of Daphne, how the nymph, finding herself pursued by Apollo, prayed to her father, the river Peneus, for help, and as a result was turned into a laurel tree, which the disgruntled Apollo used thereafter for crowns. In the sacred grove, as Philostratus tells us, there was one particular tree which was identified as the one which had formerly been the nymph Daphne, and which was accordingly worshipped. Ben-Hur enters the grove. First, he finds it a difficult thicket to get through. He gradually begins to see signs of artistic planning. Suddenly, a revelation dawned upon him. The grove was in fact a temple, one far-reaching, wall-less temple, never anything like it. The architect had not stopped to pother about columns and porticos, proportions or interiors, or any limitation upon the epic he sought to materialize. He had simply made a servant of nature. Art can go no further. Ancient authorities were clear that Daphne was a grove that contained temples. Wallace, in turning this around so that the grove itself was the temple, can be seen as the culmination of a long tradition of speculation about the relations of nature and religion. From Chambers, Goethe, and even Walter Scott, of attributing the arched ceilings of Gothic churches to an intent to imitate groves of trees, through Wordsworth's impulse from a vernal wood to the rhapsodies of Emerson and the Hudson River School of Artists. With all this, consider the comparative shock value of a novel set 2.5 centuries before Christ, in which there is not a trace of benevolent religion to be found. In 1862, Gustave Flaubert published his second novel, Salammbô, set in Carthage at the end of the First Punic War. Carthage had assembled an immense mercenary army drawn from countries all around the Mediterranean as well as Africa and Arabia, but was nonetheless defeated by Rome. It then faced the problem of paying all the surviving mercenaries, and when they felt that they were not being rewarded as they deserved, the mercenaries besieged Carthage, and a 3 years' war took place. This is the subject of Salammbô, probably the most brilliantly written of all the novels under consideration today. It is also a novel of which the concept of a trigger warning could have been invented. So, a warning. If you are likely to feel upset by a novel describing in detail war, pestilence, torture, executions, human sacrifice, cannibalism, and cruelty to animals, you may wish to give this novel a miss. The French humorous magazine, Le Journal Amusant, published a pair of cartoons on the subject. Oh, sorry, there's the Grove of Daphne at Antioch. First illustration, you can see the bourgeois saying, "Oh, a new novel by the author of Madame Bovary. I'll read it before going to bed." The second illustration shows how he slept that night, his sleep haunted by nightmares of severed heads and mutilated elephants. Why this novel, full of violence and horror, should have given its name to a very agreeable pastry is something I will not attempt to explain. And yet Salammbô became a bestseller, a sensation. It made Flaubert briefly a popular author, and put him in the strange situation, considering his hatred of the Second Empire, of being consulted by the Empress Eugénie over the design of a Carthaginian gown to be worn to a ball. Flaubert refused to allow an illustrated edition, but he died eventually, and there were at least 3 illustrated editions before the end of the century, with more to follow in the 20th. It was turned into a stage play, at least 1 opera, films, and in the fullness of time, a comic book, which I take it was somewhat toned down. I have not seen this. The only copies available from dealers at affordable prices were often dealers who refused to send things to England. Impact of Brexit on scholarship, perhaps? Now, there is no surviving history of Carthage by a Carthaginian. Roman authors tend to go on about the cruelty and horror of Carthage, to which one answer might be, look who's talking. The history of Polybius is the primary source. But once again, there was archaeology. Nathan Davis had begun excavations at Carthage in 1856. Flaubert traveled to North Africa and spent a month and a half at the site of Carthage, much of it in discussion with Davis. But the main thing about Salammbô is its style. Flaubert was criticized for larding the book with archaeological detail, such a contrast with Madame Bovary, where everything was seen from the point of view of its characters. We never learn what Bovary's house looks like because that's not something Bovary has to think about. Flaubert replied that Salammbô was written on exactly the same principles as Madame Bovary. Everything was seen from the points of view of its various characters, either individuals or groups. For there are 2 types of people in it, Carthaginians and mercenaries. For the mercenaries, everything about Carthage was new and interesting, and so they noticed everything. For the Carthaginians, their city was familiar, but they were under siege, and so periodically roused to worry about damage, looking for signs of invasion, etc. The difference between them was that while the Carthaginians knew the names of the various appurtenances of their city, the mercenaries did not, and could only perceive them in terms of physical description, color, size, dimensions, etc. And so you find that the terms of description vary according to the people whose perceptions are being described. In many cases, you'll find the same scene or event being described twice from different points of view. The novel opens with the mercenaries encamped in the gardens of Hamilcar, and we see them through the mercenaries' eyes in terms of color and pattern, the plants themselves unnamed. They found themselves beneath the front that faced Carthage, in another garden full of trimmed vegetation. Lines of white flowers all following one another in regular succession formed long parabolas, like star rockets on the azure-colored earth. The gloomy bushes exhaled warm and honeyed odors. There were trunks of trees smeared with cinnabar, which resembled columns covered with blood. Contrast that with a description of Salammbô's own garden. The soldier, Narr'Havas, is coming to tell her of his exploits in battle. She quickly drifts off and starts contemplating the state of her garden. I'm going to use the French plant names in what follows so that you have Flaubert's text rather than a translator's. She received him in her gardens under a large sycamore tree amid pillows of yellow leather and with Tanakh beside her. Her face was covered with a white scarf, which, passing over her mouth and forehead, allowed only her eyes to be seen. Narr'Havas announced the defeat of the barbarians to her. Then he began to tell her about the whole campaign. The garden, long uncultivated, had multiplied its verdure. Colocynths mounted into the branches of Caniphicias. The Asclepias was scattered over fields of roses. All kinds of vegetation formed entwinings and bowers. And here and there, as in the woods, sun rays descending obliquely marked the shadow of a leaf upon the ground. So there you have the two different styles of perception represented. If you read Salammbô, keep your wits about you and make sure to notice from whose perspective things are being perceived. Flaubert's presentation of a society riddled with superstition may be seen as a covert attack on Christianity. By the end of the century, novelists could get away with more overt opposition. Pierre Louis, a self-confessed pagan, wrote the novel Aphrodite in 1896. Perhaps I should say Aphrodite. Subtitle was Mœurs antiques, former customs, and the custom in question was sacred prostitution. So this book spent the 20th century bobbing off and on the lists of libertine literature. The novel starts with a description of the temple of Aphrodite Astarte at Alexandria. The temple of Aphrodite Astarte stood outside the gates of the town in an immense park full of flowers-shade. The Nile water, conveyed by 7 aqueducts, induced an extraordinary verdure all the year round. This flowering forest on the sea's verge, these deep streams, these lakes, these darkling meadows, had been created in the desert more than 2 centuries previously by the first of the Ptolemies. Since then, the sycamores planted by his orders had grown to gigantic size. Under the influence of the fertilizing waters, the lawns had grown into meads, the basins had widened into ponds, nature had turned a park into a champaign. But there are some problems here. There never was a temple of Astarte at Alexandria. There was a temple, or rather sanctuary, of Arsinoe Aphrodite, but it wasn't immediately outside the gates, but over a mile away at the end of the cape. And since the memory of this temple is based entirely on literary sources with no archaeological information, certainly not by Louis's time, the described design seems to have been transferred from other features of Alexandria. Now, the concept of the Middle Ages had been growing up since the late 18th century, and the word medieval entered the English language around 1820. But when did the Middle Ages start? Usual answer, with the fall of the Roman Empire. So what were gardens like in the centuries immediately following that fall, when Ravenna had replaced Rome as the cultural center of Italy and various waves of Goths were taking power? One novelist stepped in to provide the answer, Felix Dahn. Dahn was a professor of history, and he doesn't let you forget it. In the preface to his immense 3-volume novel, A Struggle for Rome, he said, "These pictures of the 6th century originated in my studies for the following works: The Kings of the Goths, volumes 2, 3, and 4, Munich and Würzburg, 1862-66, and my monograph on Procopius of Caesarea. In history, the events here described filled a period of almost 30 years' duration. For reasons easily understood, it was necessary to shorten, or at least to disguise, this long interval." In other words, he was doing what Alexandre Dumas so often did, compressing the time scheme to make things more dramatic and to make the link between cause and consequence more obvious. Dahn's 1865 monograph on Procopius is still acknowledged as the foundational work of modern Procopius studies, and is a brilliant piece of work. A third of it is devoted to Procopius's Weltanschauung, or world picture, or way of thinking, discussing everything from aristocratic prejudices to belief in demons. What a way of signaling the recapture of a world on the other side of an historical gulf. Dahn is noteworthy as the only historical novelist of the century to have actually discovered a ruined garden. When he was a student in Salzburg, he used to wander through the streets trying to work out which of them had originally been Roman roads. And eventually, remembering that many Roman villas were built on rising ground so they could incorporate streams from springs, tried hiking uphill through an area of scrub. He discovered and excavated part of a lintel, which was inscribed Hic habitat felicitas nihil mali intrat. Here dwells happiness, let nothing evil enter. Later, it occurred to him that perhaps felicitas was not an abstract noun but a personal name. Not here dwells happiness, but felicity lives here. And so he wrote a charming short novel about life on a Roman villa in the German territories in 370 AD, entitled Felicitas. Froude wanted to combat the notion that the fall of Rome was a collapse of civilization. He describes houses and gardens ranging from imperial palaces down through aristocratic villas, whether inhabited by Romans or now by Goths, and presenting domestic civilization as continuing unabated. If the restoration of topiary at Tully-Veolan symbolized the mutual acclimatization of warring factions, Donne provides a Gothic counterpart, the recreation at a provincial villa of a famous garden in Ravenna, a sign that civilization had been passed on from the Romans to the Goths. Even the technical equipment of the Romans is shown as carrying on, as when the host of a party pulls a trick on his guests. He sprang up and dashed a costly crystal cup against the table's ceiling so that it broke with a loud ring. As soon as the glass struck the ceiling, the whole of it opened like a trap door, and a thick rain of flowers of all kinds fell upon the heads of the astonished guests, roses from Paestum, violets from Thurii, myrtles from Tarentum, covering with scented bunches the tessellated floor, the tables, the cushions, and the heads of the drinkers. Sound familiar? Nero had had such a device, and Heliogabalus, according to legend, let fall such a weight of flowers that some of his guests were suffocated, by accident or design. As to the design of villa gardens, Donne has an interesting comment about a villa near Florence. The winding walks in the garden were strewed with white sand. Winding walks? We're accustomed to thinking of Roman gardens as highly geometrical. Is there any evidence for these winding walks? Is this the Sharawagi of the Ostrogoths? But Donne had an important source. Robert Castell's Villas of the Ancients, back in 1729, had emphasized the outer precincts of a villa as informally laid out areas, an argument with a significant influence on the development of the informal landscape garden in England. Donne might not have had access to a copy of Castell, but he would almost certainly have known the argument. Every edition from the second onward of Loudon's Encyclopedia of Gardening contained a woodcut version of Castell's engraving of Pliny's villa. And while Loudon's work was never translated into German, as far as I can tell, Loudon's writings circulated in Germany. Christopher Thacker, 40 years ago, suggested that any such informal areas were imitations of sacred groves. But Wilhelmina Jaszewski has said that a third of the gardens that have been excavated in Pompeii had informal layouts. In Felicitas, Donne also alleges the continued use of topiary. From the entrance, a straight path strewn with white sand led through the wide-spreading garden between tall ilices and yews, which, according to the long-ruling fashion, had been cut into all kinds of geometrical figures. A taste, or rather want of taste, which the Rococo did not invent, but only borrowed newly from the gardens of the imperators. Let us look at the treatment of the Middle Ages according to the types of gardens as dealt with in Donne. To begin with, imperial palaces. Walter Scott once again was in the lead with his novel Count Robert of Paris, set in the 11th century. He briefly describes the imperial gardens in Constantinople, concentrating on the use of automata as garden features. A tree, whose trunk seemed also of gold, shot up behind the throne, which had over-canopied with its branches. Amid the boughs were birds of various kinds, curiously wrought and enameled, and fruit composed of precious stones seemed to glisten among the leaves. It was a general custom, though like many other usages of the Greeks, it would be held childish in modern times, that by means of machinery easily conceived, the lions, at the entrance of a stranger, were made, as it were, to rouse themselves and roar, after which a wind seemed to rustle the foliage of the tree. The birds hopped from branch to branch, pecked the fruit, and appeared to fill the chamber with their caroling. Machinery easily conceived, try conceiving it someday. This is straight out of the 53rd chapter of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And since there was no careful treatment of the history of Byzantine gardens until Marie-Louise Gotthein on the eve of the First World War, I do not expect ever to find any significantly different treatment of this subject in the 19th century. Certainly, novels which show us the gardens of the former Constantinople after the Turkish conquest do not mention automata. And indeed, the use of shells as a road surfacing material is the main point made by Lew Wallace, Henryk Sienkiewicz, and Werner von Heidensdamm when they portray scenes set there. Next, monastic gardens. Here I have to report a crashing disappointment. In 1855, Joseph Victor von Scheffel published a novel entitled Eckehard. Scheffel was a novelist and poet, but he started his career with the intention of becoming an historian, and he got the idea for his novel while working on the archives of the monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland. St. Gall is famous among garden historians for providing the only surviving plan of a monastery garden from the Middle Ages. That was now generally thought to be not a plan for St. Gall itself, but a template for monastery gardens that could be adapted to different circumstances. Scheffel's novel is very scholarly, as can immediately be seen, except in the English translation, by the 42 pages of notes he appends at the end. In one passage, he describes the section of the orchard being set aside and fenced off for the keeping of rare animals donated to the monastery by foreign visitors. And he cites footnote 55. And when you look across at footnote 55, you find a passage from one of Eckehard's writings, which he used as his source. So, does Scheffel mention the garden plan? Does he even give a visualizable account of the monastery garden? No. When the unfortunate illustrator of the 1901 edition depicts gardens, they're in settings outside the monastery. Scott, in his The Fair Maid of Perth, made various reference to ecclesiastical gardens in medieval Scotland, but without describing them. But he appended a note describing the monastic garden at Perth, taken from the Transactions of the Perth Literary and Antiquarian Society. Medieval villas. In Quentin Durward, 1823, Scott described the garden of Haulieu, overlooking the Loire, starting from its present condition and working backwards. This remains run along a beautiful terrace overhanging the river Loire, which had been formerly laid out with a succession of flights of steps, highly ornamented with statues, rockwork, and other artificial embellishments descending from one terrace to another. And he then goes on to reflect about changes of fashion in garden design, particularly from the point of view of Uvedale Price. Bulwer-Lytton, in The Last of the Barons, described the garden at the Castle of the Moor, which had been developed from 1426. But in the absence of much documentation, he relied heavily on his imagination and possibly on the abundance of which is the successor estate on the site, to create an Italianate garden planned by an Italian of Mantua, and perhaps the stateliest one of the kind existent in England. Straight walks, terraces and fountains, clipped trees, green alleys, and smooth bowling greens abounded. This may all be plausible, but Bulwer-Lytton then added an unlikely range of fountains and automata. But then, in Rienzi, set a century earlier in Italy, he had imagined an unnamed garden near Florence, replete with terraces, statues, fountains, and rows of vases on marble pedestals, full Italianate style in the 1300s. Finally, castles, a building type that Donne did not have to deal with. In The Abbot, Scott described his enclosed garden at Lochleven Castle as containing statues, a turf seat, a fountain, and dull parterres. The most tantalizing account of a castle garden was provided by Wilhelm Hauff, a second-generation German romantic, who built up a great reputation for satires and fairy tales, which have probably never been out of print. And finally, in 1826, published a novel entitled Liechtenstein. Now, this is not Liechtenstein, that sovereign territory perched like a limpet on the eastern boundary of Switzerland, but Schloss Liechtenstein, a castle in Württemberg. The novel was a great success, and Hauff was acclaimed as the German Walter Scott. He then died at the age of 25. The original castle of Liechtenstein had still been vaguely extant at the end of the 18th century, as a ruin. It was demolished and replaced by a hunting lodge around the turn of that century. Then in the 1840s, a member of the family, enraptured by the novel, purchased the site and commissioned the architect Karl Alexander Heideloff to reconstruct the medieval castle on the basis of the description in the novel. The building was completed in 1854. So when a magnificent illustrated edition of the Liechtenstein was published in 1891, the illustrators had no difficulties trying to imagine the medieval castle. They drew the castle as they could see it before them. Now, the castle also had a garden, and there's one illustration by Adolf Kloss which portrays it. The gentleman halfway down is the chaperone, and he is saying, "I turn my back for 1 minute and look what happens." The text does not offer a great deal of description. The garden had beautiful fruit trees, and beds cut in strange shapes had no flowers yet, but a long yew avenue that stretched along the bank of the river and ended in a spacious arbor. Had the garden been designed to actualize the description in the novel? Does Claus's illustration show the garden as it existed in the 19th century? Unfortunately, I cannot say. The archives at Schloss Liechtenstein do not hold Heidelhoff's original plans, nor, apparently, any 19th century photographs of the garden. So the question of whether the garden at Liechtenstein was actually modeled on the historical novel dangles in front of us just out of our grasp. 1492, the year of Columbus's first voyage, was the date taken by most 19th century writers as the starting point of the Renaissance. The two major English novels set at the beginning of the Renaissance, full of excitement at the revival of learning and the new developments in the arts, were Charles Reade's Cloister and the Hearth, 1861, and George Eliot's Romola, which began being serialized in the Cornhill magazine the next year to appear in book form in 1863. These were the most heavily researched historical novels to date. Unfortunately, The Cloister and the Hearth says nothing about gardens, and Romola is little better. The buildings and topography of Florence feature far more prominently than gardens. Frederick Leighton made the illustrations for Romola, and you can see from his illustration for the episode A Supper in the Rue Chalais Gardens that he is struggling with the text to find material to depict. All Eliot says is that Bernardo had planted a garden with rare trees and had made it classic ground by receiving within it the meetings of the Platonic Academy, orphaned by the death of Lorenzo. There's a longer account of the garden shown in a painting than of a garden outdoors. As we move into the 16th and 17th centuries, we enter the period when the greatest number of 19th century historical novels was set. Just think of the variety of important themes and trends that could be considered. The Protestant Reformation, the wars of religion, the English Civil War, the rise of absolutism, Louis XIV, the Revolution of 1688. So, let us start with a group of novels centered around the massacre of St. Bartholomew in 1572. Prosper Mérimée will be known to some as the author of the original story of Carmen, on which the opera was based. He'll be known to others as France's official conservator of historic monuments, a position he held from 1833 to 1852. Among other things, he was responsible for commissioning Viollet-le-Duc's restoration of Notre Dame. In 1829, he published his only full-length novel, a chronicle of the reign of Charles IX. At one point in the novel, some court ladies decide to try their hands at magic to create a love charm. The mixing of the chemicals takes place in the garden of a Parisian house. At the garden's end, there was a kind of arbor formed by limes, which were planted in a circle and joined together by a very thick hedge, nearly as close as a wall. Two gates or entries led into this green retreat, in the center of which was a small stone table. In 1890, a special edition of the novel, illustrated by the fashionable illustrator Edward Bulwer-Lytton, was published. In the same year, the English publisher John C. Nimmo borrowed the printing blocks and produced an English equivalent with the same page layout, but in English text. Toulouse' depiction of the garden shows primarily trellis work. Is this what Mérimée had imagined? I think we can identify a likely source to match his text. If Mérimée had been looking for images of the 16th century garden, or even if he'd been looking for information about the plants being used in the potion, he would probably have come across Adam Lonitz's Herbal, which is more frequently reprinted and went into more editions than any other. It contains a woodcut which had been used by his father-in-law, Christian Eggenolf, the Frankfurt printer, who might also have come to Mérimée simply because he was the first publisher to be sued for plagiarism, for copying images from Brunfeld's Herbal without permission. This woodcut shows a garden filled with raised beds, and in one corner there's a group of trees that can easily be visualized as planted in a circle. In the 1840s, two novels were published which gave alternative political interpretations of the massacre: Balzac's Catherine de' Medici and La Reine Margot by Alexandre Dumas, translated into English as Marguerite de Valois. Balzac touches briefly on the gardens of the Chateau of Blois, which Mérimée had recently made into an historical monument, but primarily to indicate how much had changed since the events of the novel. These gardens communicated by a bridge of a fine, bold construction, which the old men of Blois may still remember to have seen demolished, with a pleasure ground on the other side of the chateau, which in our day is the fruit garden of a worthy bourgeois. Dumas limits himself to the description of a toxopholite garden, a recreation area for archery practice, but in the sequel, La Dame de Montsoreau, translated into English as Chico the Jester, he gives us our first glimpse of protective cultivation. "Where are you about to take Monseigneur?" asked Montsoreau uneasily. "Into the greenhouse." They arrived at the conservatory, and Diana continued to smile charmingly at the prince. He passed first, and then Diana and Montsoreau wished to follow, but it was impossible. His litter was too large to go through the door. At this sight, he uttered a groan. Diana went on quietly without looking at him, but Bussy, who understood her, said to him, "It's useless to try, Monsieur le Comte. Your litter will not pass." "Monseigneur," cried Montsoreau, "do not go into that conservatory. Some of the flowers exhale dangerous perfumes." Then he fainted and was carried to his room. Greenhouse? Conservatory? These are the words of the translator. The original French is simply serre both times. Serre in the 16th and even 17th centuries did not necessarily imply a building with glazed windows and roof. It could even be used for ephemeral wooden structures such as wintering sheds. The reference to dangerous perfumes suggests that Dumas was envisaging a modern conservatory with tropical plants, but the inference is not compulsory. Maurice Leroy's illustration for a sumptuous 1903 edition shows an open-work arcade that has an open-work structure of some magnificence, the sort of thing we would now call an arcade of carpenter's work, but it suggests that the artist was trying to suggest an unglazed structure that could pass as a serre. Foremost English novelist to portray the 16th and 17th centuries in the wake of Scott was William Harrison Ainsworth, often regarded simply as an imitator of Scott, but he was also greatly influenced by Victor Hugo. In Hugo's novel Notre Dame de Paris, the centerpiece is a pair of chapters, one describing the cathedral and the other giving a bird's-eye view of Paris as seen from the top of the cathedral as it was in 1482, naming but not particularly describing the various gardens that would have been visible. Ainsworth wrote 3 novels which in varying degrees followed Hugo's example. First, by making important historical sites the titles: The Tower of London, 1840, Old St. Paul's, 1841, and Windsor Castle, 1843. Old St. Paul's follows Hugo's example most closely, though integrating the interpolated essay into the action of the story. 2 of his characters go to the top of St. Paul's and look down on the city, pointing things out and commenting on them. As with Hugo's precedent, the various gardens in the city of London are named rather than described. In The Tower of London, based on the reign and destruction of Lady Jane Grey, a bird's-eye view would have been inappropriate, since the whole point of the tower in the story is the cells and the secret passages. But the book was published in a prestige edition with illustrations by George Cruikshank, and it included a map of the tower that showed the Tower Gardens and the Tower Green. Tower Green plays a larger part in the novel than the gardens because the green, a mere patch of lawn, could accommodate a variety of different activities, from ceremonial to the burning of a Protestant. In 1842, Ainsworth, who already had years of experience as an editor, founded his own magazine, Ainsworth Magazine. It ran for a little over a decade, but it allowed Ainsworth to serialize his novels without editorial interference. Windsor Castle, a novel about Anne Boleyn, was serialized in the magazine in 1842, and Ainsworth commissioned W.A. Delamot to produce illustrations for it. One of these showed the gardens, but the accompanying text is somewhat disappointing, dwelling mainly on the way in which Wyatville's alterations at the beginning of the 19th century had improved things. On the country estates of Western Europe, the spread of Italian influence in design was the most easily identified trend of the period. For Walter Pater, in Gaston de la Tour, left incomplete and posthumously published in 1896, Italian influence made the 16th century the starting point for the modern world. With their terraced gardens, their airy galleries, their conscious provision for the elegant enjoyment of all seasons in turn, here surely were the new abodes for the new humanity of this new poetic, picturesque age. What but flawless bodies, duly appointed, typically developed souls, could move on to the daily business of life through these dreamy apartments? Well, for a reminder that even in the Renaissance, few people had flawless bodies, let us turn to the flamboyant Francesco Garazzi, who wrote 3 historical novels in those intervals when he wasn't either in Parliament or in prison. The third of these was Beatrice Cenci, published in 1854, based on the same 16th century murder case that Shelley treated in his play, The Cenci. At one point, two murderers are considering how to dispose of their victim. Let us carry him into the garden and bury him underground. You've lost all your judgment. It's not enough to bury him. He must die first in a manner which may have some sense in it. Come here, take him by the head, I'll take him by the feet, and let us carry him upon the terrace which looks upon the garden. I know that this terrace leads to the antechamber, and in some places the parapet is destroyed. The poor gentleman, getting up for something during the night, was groping about without a light. Think what an imprudent thing. Perhaps he had eaten too much supper, and certainly drank more wine than usual. What an accident! Unfortunately, he missed his footing and fell. Antechamber? The original Italian has le latrine, latrines, or if you wish, the toilets. That tells us exactly why the old gentleman would have been getting up in the night, and also alerts us to one of the ancillary functions that gardens sometimes had to accommodate in the times before the introduction of indoor plumbing. Returning to the question of Italian style, Humphrey Repton argued that the styles of the 17th century, whether French or Dutch, were mere varieties of Italian. Walter Scott followed Repton in seeing Italian influence in the gardens of this period. He also introduced the word plaisance into popular discourse in Kenilworth. In Peveril of the Peak, we see the Duke of Buckingham in the 1670s planning not a French, but an Italian garden. Among Scott's immediate followers, there was no unanimity. Horace Smith, in his Walter Colleton, A Tale of 1688, published in 1830, described a garden. The front garden, stretching up to the low projecting porch, was laid out according to the prevailing French taste in all sorts of mathematical figures with clipped evergreens and rectilinear gravel walks. G.P.R. James, a prolific imitator of Scott, was able, in his 1829 novel Richelieu, to refer to trees which, being planted long before the formality of the Dutch taste was introduced in France, had in general been allowed to fall into natural groups, unperverted into the long avenues and straight alleys which disfigure so many of the royal parks and gardens on the continent. When exactly was this fashion for natural groups? Half a century later, in Conan Doyle's Micah Clarke, set in the 1680s, we're told that a few years later, our healthy English taste was spoiled by the pedant gardening of the Dutch with their straight, flat ponds and their trees all clipped and in a line like vegetable grenadiers. In truth, I think that the Prince of Orange and Sir William Temple had much to answer for in working this change, but things have now come round again, I understand. We have ceased to be wiser than nature in our pleasure grounds. I hear the influence of William Robinson there. This was written only a couple of years before Reginald Blomfield's formal garden in England reopened the controversies and denounced the landscape gardener for reliance on nature. But architectural fashion was moving gracefully from Queen Anne to Renaissance. Long avenues and straight alleys came back into fashion, and Shorthouse, in his novel John Inglesant, 1881, could praise an estate where the gardens were traversed by high hedges of myrtle, lemon, orange, and juniper, interspersed with mulberry trees and oleanders, and were planted with wide beds of brilliant flowers. The whole was formed upon terraces, fringed with balustrades of marble. Now, Dumas had managed to avoid gardens in The Three Musketeers and 20 years after, but in the final work of the series, The Vicomte de Bragelonne, which dealt with the rise to power of Louis XIV, gardens intruded themselves. Philopetaux, the illustrator, depicted Louis XIV courting Louise de la Vallière in the garden of Fontainebleau. Behind them can be seen a topiary specimen. Was there topiary of this sort in the garden at Fontainebleau in the mid-17th century? You can read through most of these histories of French gardening in the 17th century and conclude that topiary was a thing of the 16th century and had largely been wiped out. But topiary is distinctly shown in a view of the cascades at Fontainebleau that appeared in a treatise on geometry for engineers at the beginning of the 18th century, the Géométrie pratique by Manet. There you can see the topiary trees. They would have surely been swept away before the end of the 18th century, so the artist would not have known their locations or positioning and may be forgiven for putting his specimen in a rather informal-looking shrubbery. This provokes an inquiry about the reputation of the French garden and what exactly it meant, especially at a distance. In 1877, the Canadian writer William Kirby published The Golden Dog, a novel set in the last decades of the colony of New France, before the 7 Years' War resulted in it being turned into the British colony of Lower Canada. Like most Canadians of my generation who bothered to read The Golden Dog at all, I read it in the McClelland and Stewart edition of 1969, abridged to adapt it to modern tastes. Needless to say, all the passages about gardens were among the material that was removed. So one of the benefits of preparing this seminar was that I read The Golden Dog in its entirety for the first time and discovered what a good novel it actually is. At one point, some of the characters visit an estate called Beaumanoir. Colonel Philibert and Master Poitiers rode up the broad avenue that led to the chateau and halted at the main gate, set in a lofty hedge of evergreens cut into fantastic shapes after the fashion of the Luxembourg. Well, the first question is, did Beaumanoir exist? I can now confirm that it did. Kirby got much of his information, including his basic plot, from newspaper articles written by a man with an exemplary Canadian name, James Macpherson Lemoine. He later gathered some of them up for publication in book form, and in his book Picturesque Quebec, 1882, we find that Beaumanoir was a popular nickname for a house officially called the Chateau Bigot. Francois Bigot was the last governor of New France. I cannot confirm any details of the garden, however. The earliest illustration I have found dates from the 1870s, by which time the house was already a ruin. This is what it looked like in the 1890s. More important is the question about the putative influence of the Luxembourg. I can find no evidence that the Luxembourg garden ever had topiary, but there certainly was topiary on the other side of the Seine in the Tuileries garden. Look at this engraving by Pierre Aveline from the 1720s, from 1705, roundabout. Note also perhaps the horse chestnuts in the Grand Allée with their double stems, a feature that Desailliers d'Argentville condemned as in bad taste. The people of New France, 2,000 miles away from Paris and with little prospect of ever visiting it, could easily, over the course of time, have substituted the name of one estate for another, etc. The sort of mistake that Scott himself made in Peveril of the Peak, where he attributed the digging of the canal in St. James's Park to Le Nôtre rather than to André Mollet. In the final volume of the Vicomte de Bragelonne, the one known in English translation as The Man in the Iron Mask, several scenes are set in Foucault's garden at Vaux-le-Vicomte. It was common knowledge that Louis XIV, after visiting Vaux, had Fouquet imprisoned and took the team, including Le Nôtre, to work on his own palace at Versailles. Dumas gives agency to this by making Vaux the setting for an unsuccessful conspiracy to replace Louis XIV by his unacknowledged twin brother. Louis's efforts to conceal all evidence for the existence of said twin brother give him his justification for the removal of Fouquet. In one chapter, there is a magnificent peroration about Vaux, too long to quote here, which takes us through the gates, the forecourt, the mansion, the fountains, the trees, and the cascades, managing in the course of this to make scornful comments about 17th century fiction and mordant reflections about human vanity. But the writer of the greatest garden descriptions for this period was Théophile Gautier. In 1833, he published Mademoiselle de Maupin, a novel which for generations inhabited the lists of dangerous libertine literature, but which could not be ignored because it was in the preface to this novel that Gautier launched his campaign for art's sake. This is an historical novel which does not mention a single date, possibly in an effort to avoid accusations of anachronism. The result can be seen in the costume deployed in two different illustrated editions, one favoring the early 17th century and the other its closing years. But there's nothing serious to counteract this dating the story to the 1690s, which is when the historical Mademoiselle de Maupin was one of the stars of the Paris Opera, known not only for the quality of her voice, but for her tendency to wear masculine attire, her love affairs with both sexes, and her skill as a fencer who never lost a duel. 3 different gardens are described in the text. I'll give you an excerpt on one. A large flower garden on the French plan was laid out in front of the chateau. All the squares were marked out with holly and boxed with absolute symmetry. It had quite as much the appearance of a carpet as of a garden. Huge flowers in ball dresses, with majestic carriage and serene expression, like duchesses preparing to dance a minuet, bent their heads slightly as you passed. Others, apparently less courteous, stood straight and stiff, like dowagers embroidering. Shrubs of all possible shapes, excepting always their natural shape, round, square, pointed, triangular, in green and grey boxes, seemed to march in procession along the broad avenue and to lead you by the hand to the first steps of the entrance. Gautier's greatest effort at garden description came in a much longer novel, Captain Fracasse, which he announced as forthcoming a few years after the publication of Maupin, but which he didn't finish until 1863. 3 years later, Gustave Doré produced an illustrated edition, and the work became a popular favorite. This novel is set in the 1620s, during the reign of Louis XIII, and tells the story of an impoverished aristocrat who joins a troupe of traveling actors. We are shown a bright, sparkling estate which he visits, where carefully clipped boxwood borders outline plots on which, as on a piece of damask, were displayed scrolls of verdure with perfect symmetry. The background of the verdant design that could not have been more accurately traced on paper was formed of sand of various colors. Doré was an artist who flourished in darkness, so he came no closer to portraying the parterre than giving a glimpse of it at the end of a dark avenue under trees. He was much more in his element in depicting the hero's neglected, overgrown garden, quietly dropping back into the condition of a thicket or a virgin forest. Gautier's original plan had been for his hero to return to his dismal dwelling and die of starvation, but he changed his mind and had his house and garden restored. More richly described than the restoration of Tully-Veolan in Waverley, but merely a private enterprise with no political implications. The gardener had wrought to the full as hard as the architect, and thanks to his pruning, order had been restored to the virgin forest. Now no greedy branches barred the way, no sharp-thorned brambles stayed the steps, and a lady might pass on without having her dress torn. The trees once again formed arbors and arches. The clipped boxwood framed within the compartments they enclosed every flower known to Flora. And so all ends happily, except for the hero's dog, which dies of indigestion after having had a decent meal for the first time in months. In 1869, Victor Hugo, by now a magisterial figure standing on his rock in the English Channel shaking his fists at Napoleon III, published The Man Who Laughs, which contributed a new, if short-lived, turn to horticultural debate, and also introduced a new moral tone to the discussion of gardens, which did not come into its own until the later 20th century. The Man Who Laughs posits the existence, in the 17th century, of a criminal gang, for which Hugo invented the term comprachicos, who make their living by buying or kidnapping children and deforming them to become carnival freaks. Hugo used the phrase, "The comprachicos worked on men as the Chinese work on trees." Hugo got his information primarily from Robert Fortune's 3 Years' Wanderings in China, published in 1847. In 1878, there was a display of bonsai at the International Exposition in Paris, and it was reviewed for William Robinson's magazine, The Garden, by Charles Quinn. Robinson's adherence to natural gardening made him reject topiary, so his response to bonsai can be imagined. Quinn's article was entitled, "The Horticultural Comprachicos of Japan." Fortunately, the term did not take hold. James II, in this novel, had got revenge on a rebellious nobleman by selling his son to the comprachicos, who deform his mouth to fix it in a perpetual grin. He grows up as a freak show attraction until his identity is established and he takes his seat in the House of Lords, where his idealistic speech about justice is greeted with derision. The reign of Queen Anne, treated by English commentators at the time and since as the beginnings of political liberty, is presented as a virtually totalitarian society. Hugo, in the role of the 19th century Michel Foucault, wanted to expose power relationships as always present and always corrupt. Political liberty is presented as a smokescreen. And so, sandwiched between scenes of utter misery, is a list of the great estates of England, emphasizing their ostentatious wealth. Most noble and most puissant Lord Philip, Baron Herbert of Cardiff, Earl of Montgomery and of Pembroke, etc., possesses the wonderful gardens at Wilton, where there are 2 sheaf-like fountains finer than those of His Most Christian Majesty King Louis XIV at Versailles. Thomas Thynne, Baron Thynne of Warminster, and Viscount Weymouth, possesses Longleat, in which there are as many chimneys, cupolas, pinnacles, pepper box pavilions, and turrets as at Chambord in France, which belongs to the king. The Duke of Beaufort owns Badminton in Gloucestershire, a residence from which a number of avenues branch out like rays from a star. Edward Rich, Earl of Warwick in Holland, is owner of Warwick Castle, where whole oaks are burnt in the fireplaces. And so on for a few pages. The moral of all this is that the paradise of the rich is made out of the hell of the poor. Let me conclude this treatments of the century with what ought to be the horticultural pinnacle, Alexandre Dumas' Black Tulip. This novel is not concerned with the celebrated collapse in the tulip market, but with the succeeding generation, and its underlying theme is religious discord in the Netherlands, beginning with the murder of Johann and Cornelis de Witt in 1674. This novel was published in the year that Balzac died, and it shows Dumas trying his hand at Balzac's great themes of monomania and fixed ideas, presenting a wonderful portrait of envious competitors in plant breeding. Isaac Boxtel knew the temperature of his frames to the 20th part of a degree. He knew the strength of the current of air and tempered it so as to adapt it to the wave of the stems of his flowers. All at once, Cornelius van Baerle, who after all his learned pursuits had been seized with the tulipomania, made some changes to his house, next door to that of Boxtel. He raised a certain building in his courtyard by a story, which, shouting out the sun, took half a degree of warmth from Boxtel's garden. And then, after the first blush of the admiration which Boxtel could not help feeling, he began to be tortured by the pangs of envy, by that slow fever which creeps over the heart and changes into a nest of vipers, each devouring the other and ever born anew. How often did Boxtel, in the midst of tortures which no pen is able fully to describe, how did he feel an inclination to jump down into the garden during the night, to destroy the plants, to tear the bulbs with his teeth, and to sacrifice to his wrath the owner himself, if he should venture to stand up for the defense of his tulips. But to kill a tulip was a horrible crime in the eyes of a genuine tulip fancier. As to killing a man, that wouldn't have mattered so very much. Unfortunately, in the course of his researches, Dumas neglected to consult a tulip grower. In the 1670s, there was no accepted temperature scale, so it's nonsense to talk about minute differences of degrees. And why hotbeds? Dumas seems to have thought that tulip varieties were produced by the same sort of cross-pollination that his own contemporaries were devoting to hippeastrums and Cape Heaths in their greenhouses, whereas the thrill of tulip growing lay in the unpredictability of flower colors, which made tulips a good subject for bets. Alphonse Karr, in that book Les Fleurs, which I've already mentioned, devoted 6 hilarious pages to pointing out all the errors in Dumas' novel. The landscape garden that developed during the 18th century did not emerge into the historical novel until quite late in the 19th. After all, for the continental novelists, the English landscape was the vogue style of the first half of the 19th century, part of the present, not the past. In England, the formal gardens of the pre-landscape era were a subject of increasing interest in the second quarter of the century. The revival was an emerging style or group of styles. Ainsworth, in his first novel, Rookwood, in 1834, made it apparent that one might expect an historical novelist to reject the landscape movement. To the right was the garden, the pleasance of the place, formal, precise, old-fashioned, artificial, yet exquisite. For commended to us the bygone, beautiful English garden, really a garden, not that mixture of park, meadow, and wilderness brought up to one's very windows, which since the days of the innovators, Kent and his bold associates, Capability Brown and Company, has obtained so largely. This was a garden. But somehow, this did not mean that scenes set in landscape gardens were of historical interest to the novelist. Ainsworth was following the footsteps of Scott, in whose novel Red Gauntlet, set in the 1760s, Darcy Latimer writes to his friend Alan Fairford, complaining about the new landscape movement and the fashion for the natural. Describing a garden he has visited, with the usual panoply of close alleys and open walks, fountains, and an association with Philip Miller, he says, "I know that you, Alan, will condemn all this as bad and antiquated. For ever since Dodsley has described the Lesos and talked of Brown's imitations of nature and Horace Walpole's late essay on gardening, you are all for simple nature, condemn walking up and down stairs in the open air, and declare for wood and wilderness. But when I have a country house, who can say how soon, you may look for grottos and cascades and fountains. Nay, if you vex me by contradiction, perhaps I may go the length of a temple. So provoke me not, for you see of what enormities I am capable." And there, basically, the entry of the landscape garden into the English historical novel stalled. The most detailed account of an 18th century garden can be found in Louise Muhlbach's enticingly entitled novel, Frederick the Great and His Court. Muhlbach's novels, so far as I've read them, tell the story of German and to some extent European history in the 18th century from the perspective of the women of the court. This novel is set largely at Rheinsberg, the estate in which Frederick the Great grew up and which he got rid of as soon as he could after becoming king. Fritz Wendel, the gardener, was already busy with his watering pot, and was at the same time anxiously selecting and gathering the most beautiful flowers and concealing them carefully under the various plants and bushes, perhaps to protect them from the heat of the sun, perhaps to secure them from the curious eyes of some observer. Such eyes were already observing him, and resting upon him with an expression so tender and smiling that you could see that the young girl to whom they belonged had a special interest in the tall, handsome gardener, who in his modest, simple dress and his great and imposing beauty appeared to realize the truth of the old fables of the gods who visited the earth in disguise. He might have been Apollo charmed by some Daphne. This gushing language is not typical of the novel. It represents the feelings of a 14-year-old girl, a maid of honor at Rheinsberg. The love between her and the gardener, socially improper, is frustrated by the king. When she thinks she's eloping with the gardener, she is surprised to find a complete stranger awaiting her with a note from Frederick. The handsome gardener boy is not a condition to become your husband, he being now confined in a madhouse. I have chosen for you a gallant young officer of good family and respectable fortune, and I have commanded him to marry you. So, Fritz Wendel is the most important professional gardener to appear in an historical novel. Even when we approach the French Revolution and deal with the reign of Marie Antoinette, we do not find descriptions of the English garden. The Queen's Necklace by Alexandre Dumas would have been a perfect place to describe the Trianon and the Hameau, but there's not a shepherdess in sight. We're only shown Versailles being reduced to an amusement park with skating on the Swedish pond. Only with Anatole France, in his novel about the Revolution, The Gods Are Athirst, in 1912, do we hear, at this period, in all the English gardens and all the fashionable promenades, rustic cottages were to be found, built by clever architects whose aim it was to flatter the taste of the city folk for a country life. In the 1860s, a new sort of historical novel began to appear, in which the famous historical personages are swept to one side, the great events take place off stage, and the focus of attention is on the lives of ordinary people. It can be no accident that this sort of novel appears little more than a decade after the publication of Macaulay's History of England, with the third chapter that effectively inaugurated the discipline of social history. The pioneering novel of this sort was Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell, published in 1863. This is set in Whitby, called Monkhaven in the novel, in the 1790s during the war with France, and the press gang riot of 1793 is the principal historical event. There is little about gardens, and Gaskell explains why. If the farmer in these comparatively happy valleys had had wife or daughter who had cared for gardening, many a flower would have grown on the western or southern side of the rough stone house. But at that time, gardening was not a popular art in any part of England. In the north, it is not yet. Noblemen and gentlemen may have beautiful gardens, but farmers and day labourers care little for them north of the Trent, which is all I can answer for. Such gardening as is described or recalled consists of potherbs, marigolds, potatoes, onions, and such like. Within a decade and a half, 3 other major novels appeared, which in varying degrees followed Gaskell's lead in focusing on ordinary lives and avoiding the great events. All these novels were set in the Napoleonic Wars, and there may have been a good methodological reason for this. That was the oldest period for which these authors might have been able to hear oral testimony from those who were alive at the time. Trumpet Major by Thomas Hardy, 1880, is set on the south coast during the preparations for Trafalgar, but the main theme of the novel is the attempt to avoid the press gang. The 10th chapter is entitled The Advantages of a Double Garden, but horticultural description is limited to the presence of thorn hedges and slugs in the grass. But 2 other novels had appeared on the continent, which similarly concentrated on the lives of ordinary people. Tolstoy's War and Peace was serialized between 1865 and 1869. While there were indeed accounts of the battles of Austerlitz and Borodino and Napoleon's arrival in Moscow, the bulk of the novel, and in terms of bulk, a volume larger than many other people's entire historical novels, was set on country estates and Moscow townhouses. References to English parks and ornamental gardens, but little description. The novel with the best account of gardens was Theodore Fontana's Before the Storm, published in 1878. This is set in some small German towns during Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. The standard joke about this book is that it is not true to say that nothing happens in it. Book 4, Chapter 14 is specifically entitled Something Happens. But quite a lot happens. love affairs, inheritance, a burglary and its investigation, ordinary life. The threat of violence from French soldiers hovers continually over the narrative, which is set during Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, but it's only at the end that some French soldiers actually pass through with an altercation that results in 2 people being killed and a dog injured. But in the course of all this, we are shown gardens at every social level, from noble estates through an abbey garden and a priest's house, to bourgeois houses, to the hovel of the local postmistress, its only feature the protective hedge. At any rate, the rise of social history led in the closing years of the century to a slackening of tension in historical novels. Novelists increasingly could find the information they required in the publications of historians, and the need to find and present the findings of their own research diminished. From the point of view of the novelists, this was an improvement. They could now concentrate their efforts on other things and no longer sound so heavy and didactic as their predecessors. This is not to say that these later historical novels are inferior. The historical novels of Maurice Hewlett and Robert Louis Stevenson are excellent works, but they are different in tone from those of the preceding generations. When did the tradition of the 19th century historical novel come to an end? I would say with the First World War, in whose wake an opposite form of historical novel appeared, which reversed the Victorian priorities. No longer was the aim to show how different the past had been from the present. Now it was to show how similar it was to the present, the implication being, we're just as bad as they were. You thought there was something called progress? The reader of this novel knows better. This effect was achieved in 2 ways. First, by the choice of settings, circumstances, and plots that showed the greatest resemblance to modern times, especially if they were sordid. And secondly, by deliberate anachronism of language, making the people of the past speak in the accents of the 20th century, even to the extent of using contemporary slang. The presentation of gardens in 20th century historical novels may be a fertile field for research, but I think I'll let other people deal with that. Thank you.